these are just a series of questions that came up during the whole project, the book project itself. How does the history of South Korea's industry differ from the general development trends in the East Asia region? Is a question. Yes, that's a fair question to put. South Korea wasn't unique. You had Taiwan doing remarkably well also as an export-oriented economy. Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore has done phenomenally well. Despite being a city-state, done phenomenally well as a leading economy in the service sector, phenomenally well. China also picking up, has been beginning in the late 80s, came up, has done fundamentally well. So what is it? Why should we even think about South Korea? And went further to look at other issues like what about those who attribute some elements of the process to Confucian ethics? If you look at each of these countries I've named, to some degree there's some level of the Confucian ethics runs through. You'd like to think about Lee Kuan Yew, former Prime Minister of Singapore, who famously put together the concept of democracy with Asian values, which is a tweak, a tweak to, it's not just a question about Western values. There's also some element of Confucianism. How much of that has got to do with it? There's been debate also about that. We also looked at what are the attributes of the history that contemporary developing countries can take a cue from. What is it that's going to make, let's say, Afghanistan almost facing the same security conditions? What is it that Afghanistan can learn from South Korea's experience to become the next, major high-tech center of the world within a generation? Are there things that can be easily replicated? And so I'll try to look at each of these issues and give a final closing word. And yes, there's a great deal of we had to concede that there's a great deal of similarity in terms of the economic trend that was blowing through across much part of East Asia. But there are also some idiosyncratic elements, things that were uniquely South Korean. For instance, if you take Singapore, Singapore remains a city-state with, given the small population size, it's hard to be able to use that as a basis to come up with a legitimate comparison. For all its success, it had its own way. And moreover, if you look at the political evolution, on the plane of the political evolution, Singapore has maintained its a pseudo-authoritarian system for the most part of its history. Well, South Korea has been an authoritarian state up to a certain point and had come out of the authoritarian worldview with the demise of President Park, but again went on limping along the way until it finally got to where it is, even though it's still a work in progress. And if you take China, we love to talk about China also. China has made significant gain. Why would China? The trouble is that if you take the Chinese model, it's difficult to even describe what a Chinese model is. The Chinese model is, much less think about how to replicate it. The Communist Party remains a kind of a dual process between what the Communist Party is and the whole economy. The political ideology remains rooted in, call it neo-Marxist. Well, far from even being Marxist, it remains a even not even Maoist. It's a bureaucratic setup. I'll just call it that way. I call it a complex hierarchical bureaucracy. And it's given up the economy in many ways to free market credentials. So that's a very unique brand that doesn't really fit in many parts of the world. So we've gone to great length in the book to try to explain what are these elements that are consistent with the realities on the ground, and for countries that seek to emulate South Korea's experience. And there are legitimate cases that clear differences and issues that common areas that can be looked up to them. And yes, if you also look at some important issues, the geopolitical implication of the economic development history of South Korea is also remains. We try to argue to explain in the book that that's also been a distinctive feature, which may not necessarily apply to the realities of the world in which we live in now. So that remains the struggle that we've been looking at all this while. And yes, and my final word, which I've put in here, like I began by saying, this was not really very, we wasn't trying to make it look like a definitively rigorous academic work that stood to the scrutiny, but to defend a particular position, to defend a particular version of the revisionist history that is being put across this country and most parts of the region. So, in conclude, I just say that even so far as this book attempts to mount a defense of the concept of authoritarian modernism, then it's been successful. It's really dealt with all of that. But outside of the scope of authoritarian modernism and trying to come up with a more definitive, rigorous, independent history of South Korea's economic development, that remains a different subject altogether. So, in the nutshell, this is the presentation. And given the limitations that we have, I would have loved to get your feedback and get questions and thoughts. But since that is not possible, I would want to assume that we can repackage and keep these questions for the future. And granted, I'm able to get in and meet you guys sometime later this year, we might continue this conversation and continue to see how much this would unfold for the future. So once again, I want to say a very big thank you. It's been a great pleasure and an exciting opportunity to be able to share this with you. And I look forward to future correspondences and getting to meet you guys once again in the near future. So this is David Alenga from Seoul. Say a very big thank you to all of you. So you have a great day. Peace.